The first thing I heard was the beeping. Slow. Steady. Unforgiving. It sounded less like medical equipment and more like a countdown I hadn't known I was part of. When I tried to swallow, I couldn't. Something hard and foreign was lodged deep in my throat, forcing air into my lungs the way a stranger might force open a locked door. Panic surged before memory did. I tried to move. I couldn't. My hands were heavy. My chest burned. And then it hit me. Not all at once, but in sharp, ugly fragments. I was alive. Barely. The last thing I remembered before the darkness was my sister's smile. Tight. Certain. Satisfied. I lay there staring at the ceiling of the ICU. Machines breathing for me. My body aching in ways I didn't have words for yet. And one question kept repeating itself louder than the alarms around me. How did a family dinner turn into a fight for my life? My name is Nicole Ramirez. I was 30 years old when I woke up with a tube down my throat because my own sister decided to teach me a lesson. The nurse noticed my eyes fluttering open and leaned over me. She had soft gray hair pulled into a bun and the calmest voice I'd ever heard. She told me to stay still. She told me I was safe. She told me I'd had a severe anaphylactic reaction and that they'd had to act fast. Very fast. Her words floated above me like they belonged to someone else. Severe. Reaction. Act fast. I wanted to ask her how close I'd come to dying, but I was too afraid of the answer. My throat felt like it had been scraped raw. Every breath hurt. Tears leaked from the corners of my eyes without my permission. As the fog cleared, memory came rushing back with cruel precision. The smell of food. The laughter. The way everyone had been watching me. Waiting. The moment my chest tightened and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The moment I realized it wasn't. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mix-up. It wasn't bad luck. It was a prank. I'd been diagnosed with a shellfish allergy when I was a child. Not a mild one. Not an inconvenience. A real, documented, carry an EpiPen or die kind of allergy. My parents had been there the first time. They'd watched my face swell. They'd signed the hospital forms. They'd nodded along as doctors explained what could happen if I was exposed again. Somewhere along the way, that truth stopped mattering. In my family, my allergy became a personality flaw. A quirk. A story told with rolled eyes and forced smiles. Nicole is just sensitive. Nicole exaggerates. Nicole loves attention. My sister believed that more than anyone. She was older. Louder. Certain she knew better. She hated the way conversations shifted when I asked about ingredients. She hated the way people paused when I declined food. She hated that my condition forced everyone else to be careful. So she decided to prove something. I remembered the party clearly now. Her engagement dinner. Long table. White plates. Seafood everywhere. She'd promised me a separate dish. She'd sworn it was safe. She'd looked me straight in the eye when she said it. I believed her. That was my mistake. The first warning sign had been subtle. A tingling on my tongue. A warmth creeping up my neck. I'd stood up too fast. Dizzy. Trying not to draw attention. I didn't want another scene. I never wanted scenes. By the time I reached for my EpiPen, my throat was already swelling. Someone screamed. Someone laughed nervously. Someone said I was being dramatic again. Then the world tilted and collapsed into sirens and hands and darkness. Back in the ICU, the nurse asked me if there was anyone she should call. Family. Friends. Anyone. I stared at the blank wall and realized no one was there. No one was waiting. No one was pacing the hallway. They knew where I was. They just didn't come. When the breathing tube was finally removed and I could speak again, my voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger. Hoarse. Weak. Smaller than I remembered. The doctor came in and explained things plainly. Another few minutes without treatment and the outcome could have been very different. His tone wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. I nodded as if he were talking about the weather. Inside, something shifted. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. This wasn't about being dismissed or misunderstood. This was about survival. About the fact that someone who shared my blood had decided my life was an acceptable price to pay for being right. As the doctor left, the beeping continued. Slow, steady. No longer a countdown, but a reminder I was still here. And for the first time, I knew that staying alive would mean telling the truth, even if it cost me everything I thought I had left. I didn't always know how dangerous my allergy was. When you're 6 years old, all you understand is that something you ate made the room spin and your skin itch and your throat feel tight, like someone was slowly turning a knob you couldn't reach. I remember sitting on the floor of my elementary school cafeteria, staring at a half-eaten cookie while teachers panicked around me. Peanut butter. That was the first one. The ambulance lights. My mother crying. My father gripping the steering wheel too tightly as we rushed to the hospital. Doctors explained everything that night. Carefully. Repeatedly. They used words like severe, life-threatening, and avoidance. They handed my parents pamphlets and prescriptions and instructions. They showed us how to use an EpiPen. They made it very clear that this wasn't something I would outgrow. For a while, my family took it seriously. They checked labels. They asked questions. They warned relatives before holidays. I was the fragile one, the careful one, the child who needed extra attention. But even then, I could feel the impatience simmering just beneath the surface. The inconvenience of it all. The way conversations paused when I spoke up. The way smiles tightened when I asked, "Are there nuts in this?" By the time I reached middle school, the tone had changed. My allergy stopped being a medical condition and started being a joke. At least that's how it felt. My mother would sigh when I asked about ingredients, as if I were doing it on purpose. My father liked to tell stories about how tough he'd been as a kid, how he ate whatever was put in front of him and survived just fine. He said it often enough that it began to sound like an accusation. My sister leaned into it with enthusiasm. She was 3 years older, confident, effortlessly charming. She had a way of making her opinions sound like facts. At family dinners, she'd wave shrimp or crab legs in my direction, laughing when I leaned away. She'd tell everyone I was being dramatic, that I needed to relax, that a little exposure might even be good for me. "What's the worst that could happen?" she'd say, smiling wide. I learned early that protesting only made things worse. The more I defended myself, the more attention I drew. And attention was exactly what they accused me of wanting. So I adapted. I became quiet, careful. I brought my own food to gatherings without announcing it. I memorized ingredient lists. I learned how to navigate restaurants discreetly. I kept multiple EpiPens in my bag, my car, my desk drawer. I made myself small so everyone else could be comfortable. And still, it wasn't enough. Every family event came with its own test. Dishes placed just a little too close together. Ingredients described vaguely. Comments framed as concern but sharpened with doubt. Someone would always be watching me, waiting to see if I reacted, waiting to see if I slipped up. Once, at Thanksgiving, my aunt insisted the green beans were safe. She said it confidently, almost proudly. I trusted her. I ended up in the emergency room that night with hives crawling up my arms and my breathing shallow and tight. No one apologized. Instead, the story became that I must have eaten something else, that I hadn't been careful enough. Another time, my mother handed me store-bought cookies at a picnic, smiling sweetly. I pointed out the warning label printed clearly on the back. May contain shellfish. She frowned like I was being difficult. May contain isn't the same as contains, she said. You worry too much? I started to understand something then. They didn't just doubt me. They needed to doubt me. Because believing me meant admitting they'd been careless. Believing me meant accepting responsibility. It was easier to decide I was exaggerating than to change their behavior. In their version of reality, I wasn't sick. I was sensitive, neurotic, attention-seeking. And my sister became the loudest voice repeating that story. She told friends I was high maintenance. She told relatives I loved the spotlight. She joked that I should carry a bubble around instead of an EpiPen. People laughed. I laughed too. Sometimes, because laughing was easier than being the killjoy who ruined the mood. What none of them seemed to notice was how much energy it took to live that way, to constantly assess risk, to weigh hunger against safety, to decide whether speaking up was worth the looks, the comments, the sighs. By the time I was an adult, the narrative was set. Nicole makes a big deal out of nothing. Nicole has always been like this. Nicole needs to be challenged. I heard it in passing conversations. I saw it in the way people rolled their eyes when I declined food. I felt it in the way my sister smirked whenever someone questioned me, as if she were finally getting back up. So when she announced her engagement and invited everyone to celebrate, I already knew what was coming. Seafood was her favorite. She made a point of saying it. She joked about it. She promised me she'd handle it, that she'd make sure there was something safe for me. I wanted to believe her, because despite everything, I still wanted to belong. I still wanted to be the sister who showed up, who supported her, who didn't cause trouble. I told myself that this time would be different, that maybe she'd grown up, that maybe I had, too, looking back from a hospital bed, tubes and machines surrounding me. That hope feels painfully naive. What I didn't understand then was that the story my family told about me had been rehearsed for years. And at that dinner, my sister wasn't improvising. She was following a script they'd all helped write. By the time my sister announced the engagement dinner, I already felt that familiar tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with allergies. It was the kind of anxiety that came from experience, from knowing how these things usually went. Big family gatherings had become less about celebration and more about endurance, a quiet test of how much I could tolerate without saying anything. When she called to invite me, her voice was bright and rehearsed. She talked about the venue, the decorations, the guest list. She saved the menu for last, like it was an afterthought. Seafood, she said casually. Her favorite, shrimp, crab, a few fun extras. Then she added, almost bored, that she'd make sure there was something safe for me. I reminded her, gently, that it wasn't just about having a separate dish. Cross-contamination mattered. Preparation mattered. She sighed loudly into the phone. You're still on that, she said. Relax. I'll handle it. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain. Again, the way proteins travel. The way one careless utensil could put me in the hospital. But I'd had that conversation too many times. It always ended the same way. Me apologizing for being difficult. Her accusing me of making everything about myself. So I said thank you and hung up, feeling uneasy but determined to make it work. The night of the dinner, I arrived early, like I always did. I brought my own EpiPen, double-checked that it wasn't expired, and slipped it into my purse. Old habit. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I'd survived worse. The table was beautiful. Candles, white plates, glassware arranged just so, and seafood everywhere. Shrimp cocktail stacked high in silver bowls. Crab legs arranged like centerpieces. The smell alone made my stomach twist. I scanned the table until I spotted it. A small plate set slightly apart. My name written on a folded card in neat handwriting. Grilled chicken. Vegetables. Plain. Safe. I thought, or at least, safer. My sister caught my eye and smiled. That same tight smile I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. The one that said, see? I did what you wanted. You can't complain now. Guests arrived. Laughter filled the room. Glasses clinked. People congratulated her and admired the spread. I tried to stay in the background, eating slowly, carefully, keeping my purse close. For a moment, I let myself relax. That moment didn't last. Someone commented on the shrimp. How fresh it looked. How delicious. My sister laughed and said something about how everyone should try it. Then she glanced at me. You know, she said. Loud enough for the people around us to hear. Nicole used to love seafood when we were kids. A few heads turned in my direction. I shook my head. That was before I was diagnosed. I said quietly. She tilted her head. feigning curiosity. Diagnosed? She repeated. Right. But have you ever actually tried it as an adult? The air shifted. Conversations nearby slowed. I felt that old familiar heat creep up my neck. I hated this part. The public questioning. The way it turned my medical condition into a performance. I don't need to try it, I said. I'm allergic. She laughed. Not kindly. You say that like it's a fact. I could feel people watching, waiting to see how I'd respond. Someone chuckled awkwardly. Someone else murmured that allergies could change over time. My sister seized on that. Exactly, she said. Allergies evolve. Doctors say exposure can help sometimes. That wasn't true. She knew it wasn't true, but she said it confidently. And confidence had always been her weapon. I'm not risking my life to prove a point, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She shrugged. Suit yourself. Just don't expect everyone to keep tiptoeing around it forever. I turned away, my appetite gone. My hands were shaking. I told myself to breathe, to let it pass. I reminded myself that my plate was safe, that I'd done everything right. What I didn't know was that while I was trying to recover, while I was explaining to a cousin why I couldn't just try one bite, my sister was making a different choice. I didn't see her walk behind me. I didn't notice her reach for my plate. Why would I? She was my sister. She'd promised me. She'd written my name on the card herself. When I sat back down and took another bite, everything tasted the same. Normal? Fine. For a few minutes, I thought the worst was over. Then my tongue started to tingle. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe pepper. Maybe anxiety. I stood up to get water, trying not to draw attention again. The tingling spread, fast and unmistakable. My lips felt thick, my throat tight. I knew that feeling. I'd felt it before. I reached for my purse, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Someone asked if I was okay. I tried to answer, but my voice sounded wrong, muffled, like it was coming from underwater. My sister appeared in front of me, eyes wide, expression unreadable. What's wrong? She asked, too casually. What did you put in my food? I managed to say. She hesitated. Just for a second. Long enough. Don't start, she said. You're fine. I wasn't fine. I jabbed the EpiPen into my thigh with trembling hands. Someone shouted. Someone else backed away. The room dissolved into chaos. As my breathing grew more labored, I heard my sister say it again. Louder this time. She's exaggerating. She does this for attention. That was the last clear thing I heard before everything blurred. Before the floor rushed up to meet me. Before the consequences of her lesson finally caught up with us both. Someone was shouting my name. But it sounded distant, like it was coming from the other end of a long tunnel. I could feel hands on my shoulders, guiding me, lowering me to the floor. My chest was tight, every breath shallow and panicked, as if my lungs had forgotten what they were supposed to do. I focused on the burn in my leg where I'd injected the EpiPen, counting seconds the way I'd been taught, praying it would be enough. It wasn't. Faces hovered above me, blurred and warped. I heard the word ambulance and the sharp intake of breath that always followed it. Someone knelt beside me and asked questions I couldn't answer. My tongue felt swollen, heavy, useless. I tried to speak and failed. Across the room, my sister's voice cut through the noise. She's fine, she said, sharp and insistent. She always does this. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. But my body was betraying me, shutting down piece by piece. My vision narrowed. The edges of the room went dark. When the paramedics arrived, everything moved faster. Oxygen mask. Questions shouted over each other. Someone asking if I'd been exposed to shellfish. Someone else saying yes. Someone saying no. My sister's voice again. Too loud. Too defensive. She's overreacting, she said. She worked herself up. One of the paramedics shot her a look I couldn't fully see but felt in my bones. He didn't argue. He just worked needles, pressure, commands. They lifted me onto a stretcher, straps tightening across my chest. As they rolled me out, I caught a glimpse of my parents standing near the doorway. My mother's face was tight with irritation rather than fear. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. "Of course this happens now," my mother muttered. Not quietly enough. She always chooses the worst timing. That was the last thing I heard before the sirens swallowed everything. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and rising panic. I remember thinking, irrationally, that I should apologize. That I should reassure them I wasn't trying to ruin anything. That instinct ran deep, even as my throat closed and my chest burned. At the emergency room, they moved with frightening efficiency. I was rushed past curtains and monitors, past other patients whose problems suddenly felt very far away from mine. Doctors spoke in clipped tones. Someone said my airway was compromised. Someone said they needed to act quickly. I remember a mask pressed over my face. A bright light. A sharp pain. Then nothing. The darkness wasn't peaceful. It was heavy and disorienting, like sinking underwater without knowing which way was up. Somewhere in that void, I was aware of voices arguing. She ate it on purpose, my sister said. She wanted to make a point. No, someone else said firmly. This is anaphylaxis. I drifted in and out, catching fragments. Words like intubate and ICU floated by. At some point, the arguing stopped, replaced by the steady rhythm of machines. Hours later, when I surfaced again, I wasn't really awake. Not fully. I felt pressure in my throat and panic surged until something soothing cut through it. A calm voice told me to relax, to let the machine do its job, to focus on breathing. I tried, in those half-conscious moments. I kept replaying the dinner in my head, the smile, the challenge, the hesitation before she answered my question. The way she'd said maybe, like it was a joke. Like my life was an experiment she'd run just to see what would happen. It was only when I fully woke up that the weight of it settled in. The ICU was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Machines beeped softly. Marking time. Tubes and wires were attached to me in places I didn't want to think about. My throat ached deeply, every swallow painful. A nurse noticed my eyes open and smiled gently, telling me I was safe now. Safe. The word felt strange. She explained what had happened in simple terms. Severe anaphylactic shock. Respiratory failure. They'd had to intubate me to keep me alive. She said it matter-of-factly, like she told people this every day. You're lucky, she added softly. A few more minutes, and it could have been very different. Lucky. I stared at the ceiling, letting that sink in. I looked around the room, expecting to see someone, anyone. My sister. My parents. A familiar face. There was no one. The nurse followed my gaze and asked if I wanted her to call family. Her voice was kind, cautious, like she already suspected the answer. They know I'm here, I said, my voice rough and barely audible. She nodded slowly, understanding more than she let on. Later, when I was strong enough to hold my phone, I saw the messages waiting for me. Missed calls, voicemails, texts that didn't ask how I was, but why I'd let things get so out of hand. One from my mother stood out, sent while I was still unconscious. You really embarrassed your sister tonight. We'll talk when you're calmer. I set the phone down with shaking hands. That was the moment something inside me hardened. Not with anger, with clarity. I hadn't imagined this. I hadn't exaggerated. I hadn't ruined anything. I had nearly died because someone decided proving me wrong mattered more than keeping me alive. And for the first time, I understood that surviving wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something I could no longer avoid. The second day in the ICU blurred into the first, marked only by the slow shuffle of nurses and the soft hiss of oxygen. My body felt heavy, like it belonged to someone else. Every time I swallowed, pain shot up my throat, a reminder of how close I'd come to never swallowing again. I tried not to think about it too much. Thinking hurt almost as much as breathing. I kept waiting for my family to show up. I told myself they were in shock, that they needed time. That surely, once the panic wore off, someone would walk through that door and sit beside my bed. I imagined my mother smoothing my hair the way she used to when I was sick as a child. I imagined my father standing awkwardly near the window, pretending not to worry. The door stayed closed. A nurse came in to check my vitals and asked again if I wanted her to call anyone. Her tone was careful, as if she already knew the answer and didn't want to embarrass me. "No," I said. After a moment, "It's fine." It wasn't fine. But it was easier to pretend than to explain. Later that afternoon, when the room had settled into its usual quiet, the door finally opened. I turned my head, heart jumping despite myself. It wasn't my sister. It wasn't my parents. It was Evan. He stood just inside the doorway, hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his expression strained and unfamiliar. Evan had been my sister's fiancé, the man everyone said balanced her out. The calm one, the reasonable one. Seeing him there, alone, sent a ripple of confusion through me. "Hey," he said softly. "How are you feeling?" I tried to answer, but my voice came out thin and uneven. "Still here," I said. It was the best I could manage. He nodded, eyes flicking briefly to the monitors before settling back on me. He looked tired, older somehow, like he hadn't slept. "I'm really sorry," he said. "About everything." There was a weight to the way he said it that made my chest tighten. This wasn't a polite apology. This was something else. I waited. He pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The machines filled the silence. I didn't know what to do, he finally said. At first, I thought maybe it really was an accident. But then I saw something. My pulse quickened. Saw what? He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hand shook slightly as he unlocked it. He turned the screen toward me. It was a photo. The angle was unmistakable. The table, my plate, and my sister's hand hovering over it, fingers pinching pieces of crab meat she'd taken from another dish. Her head was turned slightly, checking to see if anyone was watching. My stomach lurched. I took it without thinking. Evan said quickly, "I thought she was just being careless. Or, I don't know." I didn't want to believe it meant what it looked like. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. The room seemed to tilt, not with panic this time, but with something colder. He scrolled to another image, a second angle, clearer, no room for doubt. "She did it on purpose," I whispered. Evan nodded, jaw tight. "Yes." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The photo sat between us like a confession no one could take back. Years of doubt, of being questioned and dismissed, collapsed into that single frozen moment. "I showed this to the doctors," he continued, "and to hospital administration. They said they're required to report it." My heart skipped. "Report it? How?" "To the police," he said. "Nicole, what happened to you isn't just a family issue. It's a crime." The word hung in the air, heavy and unreal. A crime. I thought about all the times I'd been told I was overreacting, all the times I'd apologized for my own safety, all the times I'd convinced myself that keeping the peace mattered more than being believed. "And my family?" I asked quietly. Evan's expression hardened. "They're angry," he said. "Not scared, not remorseful. Angry. They keep saying you blew this out of proportion, that you embarrassed everyone, that you're trying to ruin the engagement." I closed my eyes, absorbing the familiar sting of it. Even now, even after everything, the narrative hadn't changed. "They asked me to convince you not to cooperate," he added, "to make this go away." I opened my eyes, and "I couldn't," he said. "Not after seeing that photo. Not after watching you collapse." His voice broke slightly on the last word. Something shifted then. Not dramatically. Not all at once. but enough that I could feel it. This wasn't just my word against theirs anymore. A doctor came in shortly after, followed by a woman from hospital administration. They spoke to me gently, explaining procedures, laws, obligations, deliberate exposure to a known allergen, mandatory reporting, investigation. They asked if I was willing to give a statement when I felt up to it. I said yes. I expected fear to follow that decision. Instead, I felt strangely calm, exhausted, but calm. After they left, Evan stood to go. He hesitated at the door. "I'm not going through with the wedding," he said quietly. "I can't marry someone who would do this. And then lie about it." I nodded, though my chest ached with the weight of it. Another life unraveling because of a choice I hadn't made. When he left, the room felt emptier than before. But it also felt different. For the first time since I'd woken up, I wasn't questioning my own reality. I wasn't wondering if I'd imagined something or made it worse than it was. I had proof, and proof had a way of changing everything. As the machines continued their steady rhythm, I stared at the ceiling and let the truth settle in. What happened to me wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a prank gone wrong. It was intentional. And whether my family liked it or not, there were consequences waiting on the other side of that truth. The first thing I noticed when they moved me out of the ICU was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the hollow kind that comes after something catastrophic has already happened. My body was stable now. They said, "out of immediate danger." The words should have comforted me, but they didn't. Stability felt fragile, like a thin layer of glass over something still burning underneath. My throat was sore enough that every swallow reminded me of the tube that had been there. My chest ached when I took deep breaths. Bruises bloomed along my arms from IV lines and blood draws. I looked like someone who had survived something serious, even if I still didn't fully feel it yet. A nurse helped me sit up and asked how I was feeling. I said okay out of habit. She didn't push. Nurses always seem to know when not to. Later that morning, a hospital social worker came by with a clipboard and a careful expression. She explained that because my reaction had been life-threatening and involved deliberate exposure, there were protocols they had to follow. A report had already been filed. Law enforcement would be notified. An investigation would begin. I nodded, listening as if she were talking about someone else. "Do you feel safe going home?" she asked. The question landed harder than anything else she'd said. I hesitated. Images flashed through my mind. My sister's smile, my mother's text, my father's silence, the way they'd watched me collapse and still found a way to make it about inconvenience. "I don't know," I admitted. She wrote something down and gave me a small, reassuring smile. "That's okay," she said. "We'll make sure you have support." Support. The word felt foreign. By the afternoon, my phone started ringing. I didn't answer the first few calls. I let them go to voicemail, watching the screen light up with names I knew too well. When the messages started coming in, I made myself read them. My sister left 3 voicemails in a row. The first was frantic, insisting this was all a misunderstanding. The second was defensive, accusing me of not telling the full story. The third was angry, warning me that I was blowing things out of proportion. My mother texted shortly after, "We need to talk. This has gone far enough." My father didn't call at all. I felt something inside me detach, like a thread snapping cleanly instead of fraying. I wasn't surprised. I was tired. That evening, a detective came by to introduce himself. He was polite, calm, methodical. He asked me to walk him through what happened. Starting with my medical history, I told him about my diagnosis, my EpiPens, the repeated dismissals. I told him about the dinner, the challenge, the hesitation before my sister answered me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just told the truth. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "We'll be following up with everyone who was there," he said. "And we've been provided with photographic evidence." I knew he meant Evan's photos. After he left, I sat alone in my hospital room as the sun dipped below the window line. The silence pressed in again. I realized then that something irreversible had happened. Not just medically. Personally, this wasn't something I could smooth over. There would be no family meeting where everyone hugged it out. No apology that made it all go away. The truth was out. And it was heavier than anyone had expected. The next day, the bill arrived. Not the full statement yet. Just an estimate. Ichiukare. Emergency response. Medications. Specialist consults. The numbers blurred together until my eyes caught on the total at the bottom. $160,000. My hands shook as I set the paper down. I'd known it would be expensive. I hadn't known it would be that expensive. I thought about my job, my savings, my careful budgeting. There was no version of my life where I could absorb that cost alone. And then the thought came. Quiet but unmistakable. Why should I? That afternoon, my sister called again. This time, I answered. She didn't ask how I was. She launched straight into panic. Then bargaining. She said she hadn't meant it. She said she thought I'd be fine. She said she was scared. She said the police were asking questions and it was stressing everyone out. You need to tell them it was an accident, she said. You need to fix this. I listened without interrupting. Nicole, she added sharply. This could ruin my life. I looked around the hospital room. The beeping machines. The tray of untouched food. The bruise on my arm. The estimate sitting on the table beside me. You already tried to end mine, I said quietly. She went silent. Then she scoffed. You're being dramatic. That word again. The same one she'd used my whole life. I hung up without saying anything else. Later, Evan stopped by briefly to check on me. He told me my family was scrambling, trying to get ahead of the narrative. He told me they were calling lawyers. He told me they were angry at him for betraying them. I'm done protecting lies, he said. Even if it costs me? After he left, I stared out the window and felt something settle deep in my chest. Not rage. Not satisfaction. Resolve. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to destroy anyone. I wanted accountability. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted to stop pretending that what happened to me was acceptable. By the time I was discharged, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, I wasn't going to be quiet anymore. The calls didn't stop once I got home. If anything, they intensified. My phone lit up constantly. Numbers I knew by heart and numbers I didn't recognize at all. I stopped answering after the first day, letting everything go to voicemail. But the messages kept coming anyway, stacking up like proof of just how desperate everyone had become. At first, the tone was concerned. My mother left a message telling me she was worried about me. That stress could make everything feel worse than it really was. She said we should talk privately, as a family, before things got out of hand. She said mistakes happen. Then the tone shifted. My sister sent a text that simply read, "You need to fix this now." Another followed minutes later. "The police are calling people. This is getting serious." As if it hadn't been serious when I couldn't breathe. A few hours later, my father finally called. I let it ring until voicemail, my hands shaking even as I told myself not to care. When I listened to the message, his voice was calm, controlled, the way it always was when he wanted to sound reasonable. "You're overreacting," he said. "You know that we can handle this without involving lawyers and police. You're going to regret taking it this far." Regret. The word echoed in my quiet apartment. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photo Evan had shown me. My sister's hand over my plate. The casualness of it. The certainty that she was right and I was wrong. I woke up with my heart racing, my chest tight, my body still remembering what my mind was trying to process. The next morning, I met with a lawyer. She was a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and a steady voice. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything, starting from my childhood diagnosis to the moment I woke up in the ICU. I handed her copies of my medical records, the hospital estimate, and Evan's photos. She looked at the images for a long time before speaking. "This is not a prank," she said finally. This is deliberate harm. Hearing it stated so plainly made my throat tighten, not with fear this time, but with something closer to relief. She explained my options carefully. Criminal charges were already in motion, separate from anything I chose to do. But the civil side was up to me. Medical bills, damages, accountability. And you should be prepared, she added. For your family to push back hard. She was right. That afternoon, the pushback arrived in full force. My sister called again, her voice shrill with panic. She accused me of exaggerating my symptoms, of turning a misunderstanding into a legal nightmare. She said I was trying to destroy her life out of spite. She said I'd always been jealous of her, when I didn't respond the way she wanted. She changed tactics. You know they'll believe me, she said. Everyone knows how you are. Emotional. Dramatic. If this goes to court, they'll tear you apart. I listened, oddly detached. I'd heard versions of this my whole life. The difference now was that I wasn't alone with it. Later that evening, my mother showed up at my door without warning. I didn't let her in. I stood on the other side, listening as she cried and pleaded and finally snapped. You're doing this to punish us, she said. You've always liked being the victim. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, but it didn't swallow me this time. I almost died. I said through the door, and you're still blaming me. She went quiet then, but only for a moment. If you keep this up, she said coldly, we'll tell people the truth about you, about your mental health, about how you exaggerate things. We'll fight back. There it was. The threat beneath the concern. The same pattern. Finally exposed. After she left, I sat on the floor with my back against the door and let myself cry. Not because I was scared of them, but because I was grieving something I'd been holding on to for years. The idea that if I just explained myself one more time, they'd understand. They never would. Over the next few days, I learned just how far they were willing to go. Friends forwarded me messages my family had sent, suggesting I'd staged the reaction. That stress and anxiety could mimic allergic symptoms. That I was unstable and needed help. Each lie only strengthened my resolve. My lawyer assured me that their behavior would only hurt them. That attempts to discredit me would be scrutinized. That the evidence was solid. Still, it hurt. It hurt to see how easily they chose themselves over me. How quickly they closed ranks. Rewriting history to protect their image. Evan called one night, his voice tired but steady. He told me my sister was furious with him for cooperating. That my parents had accused him of betraying the family. That the engagement was officially over. I'm sorry, he said. I should have seen this sooner. You did the right thing, I told him, and I meant it. When I hung up, I looked around my apartment. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt intentional, protective. For the first time, I wasn't trying to manage anyone else's feelings. I wasn't minimizing what happened to keep the peace. I wasn't apologizing for being alive. I signed the paperwork the next morning. As I put my name on the page, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. Clear, like I was finally standing on solid ground after years of shifting sand. My family had chosen denial. They'd chosen threats and lies and intimidation. I chose the truth. And from that moment on, there was no turning back. 6 months later, the courthouse felt smaller than I expected. I sat on a hard wooden bench with my hands folded in my lap, listening as the judge read through the final terms of the settlement. The words were calm, procedural, almost boring, which felt surreal considering how much blood, fear, and silence had led to this moment. My sister stood on the other side of the room, her shoulders stiff, her eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't look at me once. The judgment was clear. The court recognized what happened as deliberate harm, not a misunderstanding, not a joke gone too far. My medical records, the ICU reports, the expert testimony, and the photographs had painted a picture no one could talk their way out of. The lawsuit ended with a 6-figure settlement, $160,000. Enough to cover my hospital bills, my ongoing treatment, and the legal costs they had tried so hard to scare me away from. But the money wasn't the moment. The moment came when the judge said the plaintiff's actions were reasonable and necessary to protect her life and her rights. For the first time in my life, an authority figure said out loud that I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't exaggerating. I wasn't the problem. When it was over, people stood, papers shuffled, chairs scraped against the floor. My parents left quickly, avoiding eye contact, already whispering to their attorney. My sister hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if she might turn around, as if she might finally say something real. She didn't. I walked out alone into the afternoon sunlight, my lungs filling easily, my steps steady. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way I'd never experienced before. No calls, no messages, no family group chats blowing up with accusations or guilt trips disguised as concern. According to a cousin who reached out privately, the narrative back home was that I'd betrayed them, that I'd chosen money over family, that I'd destroyed something sacred. I let them tell that story. In my version of events, I chose oxygen over silence. I chose survival over politeness. I chose myself. I moved to a new apartment with better light and a kitchen that felt like mine. I cooked without fear, without checking labels 10 times because someone else might have tampered with them. I slept through the night without waking up to phantom tightness in my throat. I still carried my EpiPen. Always would, but it felt like a precaution now. Not a shield against the people who were supposed to love me. Therapy helped more than I expected. Not because I doubted what happened, but because I needed to unlearn the reflex to minimize pain. To stop explaining myself before anyone even asked. To stop assuming that being hurt was something I needed to justify. One afternoon, my lawyer called to confirm the final payment had cleared. "It's done," she said. "You can close this chapter." After I hung up, I sat by the window for a long time, watching cars pass, watching people move through their ordinary lives. I thought about the version of myself who woke up in the ICU, terrified and confused, wondering how a family joke had turned into a breathing tube. I wished I could reach back and tell her what I knew now. That surviving doesn't make you dramatic. That speaking up doesn't make you cruel. That holding people accountable isn't the same thing as seeking revenge. Sometimes justice doesn't look like an apology. Sometimes it looks like distance. I did hear from one family member eventually. A short message from an aunt I'd always liked, saying she was sorry she hadn't said anything sooner, that she hoped I was okay. I thanked her and meant it. Some bridges don't need to burn. Some just need space. On the anniversary of the incident, I made myself a quiet dinner and ate it slowly, deliberately. I breathed deeply, feeling air move in and out without resistance. I thought about how close I'd come to losing that simple, miraculous thing. I didn't lose my family that day. I lost the illusion of one. What I gained was harder to explain but easier to live with. Safety. Clarity. The understanding that love doesn't test your limits for entertainment. That anyone who demands you prove your pain doesn't deserve access to your life. If you've ever been told you were too sensitive while you were suffering, if you've ever been blamed for the harm someone else caused you, you're not alone, and you're not wrong for wanting to protect yourself. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share where you're watching from, or share your own experience if you feel comfortable. And if you want to stay with this channel for more stories about standing up to family dynamics that cross the line, make sure to subscribe and stay a while. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't forgiving. It's finally choosing to breathe. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.